Rod Mullins, and the reason why I'm here is to discuss a little bit about my family's involvement, which I really didn't know about here until probably the last few weeks after Margaret had asked me would I participate in this. And the first thing that came to my mind was, what did my family have to do with this killing at Killing Rock? Just because my last name is Mullins doesn't necessarily mean that I'm connected. Well, I was wrong, okay? I was wrong big time. In fact, after doing a little bit of searching as I went on a little bit more, I found out that there were about 2 or 3 more of my families connected into this some way or another. Maybe not directly involved with what happened back here, but still they were involved. And Margaret asked me to speak tonight about Ira Mullins and what I knew about Ira Mullins. And if you are not familiar with who I am right now, I'm going to give you a little bit of information about who I am. First of all, I co-host a podcast. And I don't know if you're familiar with podcasting. Some of you just started picking up on it. I know Arvil had mentioned it here a little bit earlier. I co-host a podcast with a gentleman from Kingsport, Tennessee by the name of Steve Gilley, and it's called Stories, A History of Appalachia. And what we do is we do a podcast about every week, and we talk about a subject in Appalachia. It could be anything from here in Wise County, Dickinson County. It could be something as far away as in Buffalo Creek, West Virginia. We did something here recently having to do with the Buffalo Creek disaster and the Pittston, the pond that broke loose in 1972 that did so much damage and changed a lot of ways that people look at the way the mining industry did things back in those days. And we just recently finished a big series on, matter of fact, it takes over an hour to listen to it, on the Hatfields and McCoys. And Steve had uncovered some things about the Hatfields and McCoys that, despite what you may have heard and seen of the Kevin Costner miniseries on History Channel, and also some of the other books, Steve had uncovered some things from some of the family as the way that the situation really played out. And it's a very interesting podcast, and I'm not just saying that because I'm involved in it, but it is. I've learned a lot along the time. Arvil had mentioned about the fact I did a podcast here with Steve recently about the trials of Edith Maxwell, and that's something I'll be speaking about here during Pound Heritage Days as well. But I'm here tonight to tell you mostly about Ira Mullins and his connection with my family. And until I knew about it here just a few weeks ago, I knew that Ira Mullins was unfortunately the poor crippled man that was riding in the wagon that got killed here at Killing Rock, and his family was mortally wiped out except for Jane, who managed to get off the mountain and managed to stay in hiding per se until everything was taken care of. Little did I know that Ira was the nephew of my great-great-grandfather, who was Andrew Jackson Mullins. If you do not know who Andrew Jackson Mullins is, he went by a better name, Brandy Jack. And Brandy Jack was a known counterfeiter. And I will say this, there were 2 forms of enterprise that you got involved in the Southwest Virginia, Eastern Kentucky mountains, probably prior to, or I guess after the Civil War, and that was moonshining or counterfeiting. Those were the 2 choices that you had, because until that time you had timbering, you had some timbering and things like that, but mining really hadn't kicked in a full kind of production probably until about the 1890s or around the turn of the century. So people were still trying to fight to survive and to get by on what they could. My great-great-grandfather went and served time in the federal penitentiary for putting too much silver into his coins. Now, when you ask that question, how did he put too much silver in his coins? He used what's called baker's silver that was used by dentists back then. And he produced his coins that were virtually, they couldn't tell the difference when the government had a hold of them. The only thing that the government had to be able to do was to assay them and find out, there's too much silver in here. We can't be having this going around. So they sent him off for 7 years. But the connection is between Brandy Jack and his brother, Marshall Bigfoot Mullins. And that's where I started finding out the connection. I also started finding out the connection that I guess I'd been raised for a long time believing that Ira Mullins was this poor innocent man that all this stuff had happened to. Ira wasn't exactly, he wasn't an angel, let's put it that way, okay? He had been involved in something that happened back at the Wise Courthouse, or actually in Gladeville at the time, in which Marshall Taylor, Doc Taylor as we call him, Red Fox, when he was a U.S. Marshal, he had went and at one time had heard about Ira Mullins bringing in unstamped liquor through Wise. And Marshall Taylor, Doc Taylor at that time, went and decided, as part of his job and responsibility as being with the U.S. Marshal Service in true Raylan Givens justified ways, he decided he was going to go and he was going to bust Ira Mullins for that. There was a massive gunfire, eruption of gunfire that happened in the streets, and there were a lot of people wounded. I think there was maybe 1 or 2 people killed. But from that point on, Ira Mullins, I don't think he got touched out of the whole thing, out of this entire gunfire thing that happened. But at that time, Ira Mullins swore that he would have revenge on Doc Taylor, one way or the other. And during my time that I was reading up on some of this information, I found out that Ira Mullins had put out a $300 bounty. And that time, that was big money. But he put out a $300 bounty out on Doc Taylor's head, if somebody could take him out. Folks, I want to say this, and this is the best way I can say it. My dad is almost close to 89 years old. My dad has been very quiet about family history because when I mentioned about my great-great-grandfather, Brandy Jack, he didn't know a lot about him growing up. He did not know a whole lot about him. He has heard a lot about Devil John Wright, and he had heard about some other people, but he didn't know a whole lot about him. But when I started talking to him a little bit about Ira Mullins, he knew a little bit about the story about the Killing Rock. But when we talked a little bit about that, the first thing my dad said to me, he said, you need to realize something. He said, this part of the country had the worst people, some of the worst people. The Wild West had nothing on this part of the country, on Appalachia. You didn't trust people back in those days. A lot of people you didn't trust. And I'm sure that's probably where you've heard the term in-laws and outlaws. You've probably heard that term before. That probably rings very true with this whole situation, because if you were in with your in-laws and your family one day, if you did something the wrong way the next, guess what? You were an outlaw probably with them, is what happened. Well, the other connections that ended up, besides the story that you're going to hear here about Killing Rock, is my connection was also with the Vanover family. And the Vanover family had connections with Ira Mullins because Ira supposedly kind of set up housekeeping, I guess, to a certain degree on land owned by Henry and Jane Vanover, and he really wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. And then Henry Vanover was killed. Jane Vanover ended up having to take over the large collection. At that time, they were doing a timbering business, and there were a lot of lawsuits on Henry at that time. But that was one connection that the Vanovers had. My mother's mother was a Vanover, originally from Flintwood, and I started being able to figure out there's only one set of Vanovers that ever came into this area, and that's the Vanovers. And then the other is my great-great-grandfather, John Vent Bentley. And I'm sure if you go back into history and you read a little bit about Killing Rock, John Vent Bentley was probably about 4 miles away here from Killing Rock. And he was one of the very people that made the assessment when he came up here that there had been a really bad gun battle up here. But, you know, I don't think you ever hear anything about guns being fired from the Ira Mullins clan or anything. This was just a flat-out ambush, or at least that's what it's portrayed as. And John Vent Bentley told about the story about people with bowels hanging out of their body, and then the gunshots where they were and so forth. And he's also one of the people that makes the connection in there about that there were only 2 people that he knew of. He saw some shell casings lying around from where the bodies were and from where the shots had come out. And he made the connection. He said, there's only 2 people that I know of that would have had these kind of rifles and this kind of ammunition. One of those people would have been a Potter, which he mentioned. The other would have been, as they call, Bad Henry Adams. Now, the connection's always been with Bad Henry Adams and then some of the others. Of course, we know that Cal and Heenan Fleming was allegedly involved with the killing up here at Killing Rock. But Bad Henry Adams was also allegedly involved as well. But with as many gunshots that rang out up here that day on that particular time, there must have been at least a pretty good-sized posse up here that was waiting on them. It couldn't have been more than about 2 or 3 people. Not unless Doc Taylor had managed some way to reach beyond the grave and have people fire off guns or something like that with all his mysticism and herbalism that he had gotten into during that time, unless he'd come up with some kind of way to do that. But, it's very interesting. I sit here tonight as I get ready to close out, and I wonder if 125 years now since this has all happened, I wonder if they were here, I wonder what they'd be thinking about all this. I wonder what Doc Taylor would be saying about all these people that have gathered down here in this little small part of this path and just wondering, why are you all here? He was doing a job supposedly to go and take care of what he thought was his job of taking care of moonshine, and what he was doing at the time, and then also handling his personal vendettas. But I also wonder what the Mullins family would have thought at the same time about all this. And I wonder if they would have made any big deal about it. The press made a big deal about it back then. We don't think of it too much now because it's old history, 125 years ago. But when Doc Taylor was in the process, or Tout Hall, I should say, in the process of being hanged at the Wise County Courthouse, they had reporters down here from the Washington Post. The National Police Gazette came in here, and they were interviewing Tout Hall and his connections with Doc Taylor. It was big news back in those days because to them, on the East Coast, this was their version of the Wild West. That's what it was. If you'd like to find out more about some of these stories that, with the Killing Rock and so forth, we did a story on the Killing Rock and Bad Ira Mullins, and we've also done a podcast on Devil John Wright and some others. You can go to a website. It's called storiespodcast.net, and you can listen to those podcasts. And what we try to do is we try to go and we try to highlight history about Appalachia. And, so many times we get our history, it's so twisted and everything else from the way the media portrays us here in Appalachia. We're just trying to put a positive turn on the way that our history should be here in Appalachia. And it's as important as the way that the history is outside of Appalachia. And I think it's even more important, and it's even more fun. So I'm pretty much finished. Anybody, any questions or anything like that? Anybody?
There's
Yes.
a lot of people who've never been here before. Is there any way you can kind of address this area where we actually are and where things probably happen?
I can't. I'd say probably you might be able to do it a little bit better than I can. The next speaker coming up, I can tell you that probably more than anything else, this was a perfect place for you to be able to lay in wait and be able to get somebody. And you have to remember, Doc Taylor, when I mentioned this thing about Mountain Mafia, and I mentioned this thing about the Civil War, there were things back from the Civil War that were never solved. There were things of families that had been divided, that had been split apart because of the slavery issue, and just so many other things that had happened. But those wounds didn't heal after the Civil War. And there were things that even went on even further after the Civil War. We deal so much with listening to history now and talking about tearing down Jefferson Davis statues in New Orleans and tearing down Robert E. Lee statues in Charlottesville. There were deeper cuts and deeper wounds here in Southwest Virginia and Eastern Kentucky, more so than what there were in other portions of the country. I mean, there were some bad things that happened in the South, but there were a lot of deep wounds, emotional wounds with families. And, they carried on vendettas for a long time. And a lot of their training, a lot of their things that they did while they were Confederate soldiers, it came into play probably in an area like this. Guerrilla warfare was probably more than anything else the big thing of how they were able to go and lay in wait and be able to ambush them when they came up this path, when they were coming over the gap, or actually coming over from Jenkins, coming over into Virginia was what they were doing, because this was the main thoroughfare. This was the main way to be able to get from Virginia to Kentucky during that time. There was no other way. You had to come up this way. You had to come up through the mountains. It's not the 4-lane like what you see now in the big gap, and like what I saw yesterday down at Cumberland Gap. You look down there and you see, oh, such a nice highway. It wasn't that way. It was rough. It was rough, and it took a lot to have to get through here. And it was a perfect place. And if you don't know the reputation about Pound, for some of you that's here, Pound was a very rough place too. Pound was a very rough place. And my dad has told me many times, even though he says 88 and 89 years old, he's young to remember that, but he says Pound was one of the rough places, one of the roughest places when he was growing up of anybody that, you know, any place in the world that anybody could go to. He says you had outlaws, vigilantes, any kind of ruffian that could possibly come to Pound, they came to Pound. And he said just because it was along the border with Kentucky, he said that made for even more mischief between the two. That's how things happen. And so it's always been interesting, but that's sort of my connection with Brandy Jack, my great-great-grandfather, and also with Ira Mullins and all this with up here at Killing Rock. So, anything else?
I have a question.
Okay.
How long have you been doing this?
How long? Actually, I've only been doing this a year.
Really?
Yeah, but I've been teaching for a long time, too.
You have just given one of the best accounts I have ever heard. You covered all of them with dignity. I like that.
Well, the thing that we try to do on the podcast, and we talk about this, and my friend yesterday, Steve, we talked about this. We're not professional history people. We go and we just dive into this thing because we love history. That's what I love about history. I just love about the facts and being able to find out some of this information. You know, what's happened 125 years ago. I can't go back and change it. You know, you may get up here and we may start World War III up here on the mountain tonight after we find out about Henry Fleming and Cal Fleming and their sides of the story. Who knows? But, folks, it's already happened. You know, the thing that we can go back and look on is how did it happen, what caused it to happen, and, you know, how can we prevent something like this from ever happening again, per se. It's always going to go on. But, you know, I guess I love history. I'm not a professional history person, but I just love it. I just love history altogether as a whole, and I love Appalachian history more than anything else. So,
It shows.
thank you.
Do you know how Pound got its name?
Because of the mill, I think that was part of it. Because of the mill, that's the old mills that they had that was, I guess, over at Mill Creek.
The pounding mill, like
there
where
at
they
the
pound
creek,
ground
Robertson Mill.
corn mill.
So, and that's always, that
And
name always
everybody
stuck.
would say, let's go to the pound, the pound.
Horses down there,
Yeah.
about where IGA is, out the Indian Creek.
Yeah.
They used to
coming
pound
back?
the Indians.
And the Pound Bottom.
And Pound Bottom, they used to pound their horses down there. You know, corral them. Yeah. Keep the pound, you know, corralled up. Yeah, it was before the mill. It was more than likely it was where they used to pound their horses down there right from out the Indian Creek.
I had
You
no
know, and I
idea.
will say this before I close, there is another bit of history, too, that I can at least relate to a little bit and talk about. There is a podcast, and maybe I can get Steve to put it back up here a little bit later. But how many of you are familiar with Doc Haddon, Lawrence Haddon?
That was my great
Yes.
grandpa.
Yeah,
The
my
story
great
of
great
Doc
great
Haddon-
grandfather.
The story of Doc Haddon is also, we did that on our podcast, and the friend of mine that does the podcast with me, he had never heard of Doc Haddon before. And the question he kept on saying, why in the world would someone leave England to come here and do what they did? And you have to listen to the podcast because it's an extremely deep podcast about what all he got involved in here and what he did. But it's very interesting. I mean, Pound is just full you know, a lot of different characters over the years, and Doc Haddon was one of them. And I mean, it's, you know, you go to so many different places, and people will ask you different questions about when you bring up something about Pound, and somebody brings up about Pound, for example. One of the first things that comes out is Francis Gary Powers and his U-2 flight. That's one thing that comes out. Another that people bring out is about Edith Maxwell. Some people will bring that out, those that remember it. But a lot of people, they'll say, is that close to where the Killing Rock's at? So, you know, it's at least remembered where that's at. So, thank you very much. I appreciate it.